Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the American Years podcast. I'm Kate Simpson, coordinator of the American Years project. Our project is creating space for and recording the many stories and memories of all the people whose lives are intrinsically linked to the American Navy's presence in the Holy Loch by Dunoon on the west coast of Scotland. In this episode, I talked to local author, sailor, and my dad, Euan Ross, about growing up in the Holy Loch in the shadow of the ship.
Who am I? Well, Euan Ross, local from Cowell, Holy Loch district. Grew up there. Went to Rashfield School, then Dunoon Grammar. For my sins, I was the school captain there. And then from there went to Aberdeen University, then Robert Gordon's Business School, then Strathclyde University. And basically after all that was over and a little bit of practical work, I took the first opportunity available and moved overseas to work. And thereafter 30 years overseas before coming home. And since then, I've been doing a little work from here. But more recently, I've been writing the books. Well, I was 9 years old when the Americans arrived. Before that, we had obsolete Liberty ships moored in the Loch. And then there's a whole history of redundant vessels being moored there. After beginning of the century, maybe around 1905, we had early battleships moored out there. And then after the First World War, there were also naval vessels. Then in 1939-45 war, there was a British submarine base, which survived the duration of the war. After that, then we had the Liberty ships. And I remember my father used to, in the summer, go down and swim out to these boats for a cup of tea and an Abernethy biscuit with the skeleton crews. So anyway, the Americans arrived when I was about 9, I think, March 1961. And my friends and I, we saw the boat coming in the distance, but then we went off and did something more interesting. When we came back to the house, there it was sitting in front of the house. And basically life was never the same for the next 30 years for people in the Loch side. The continual noise of generators, it was never quiet. It was never dark because of the arc lights on the boat, which were on 24 hours a day. And we could hear everything that was going on out there. You'd have the continual fire, fire, fire. This is not a drill. Everybody to X, Y, Z stations. And indeed, there were people did die of fires on board. There were nuclear emergencies. There were all kinds of things happened that were routinely denied, but that was life on the Loch at that time, and we became used to it. It became almost permanent.
Yeah, people have said that people had a different experience with the ship if they were on the Loch side compared to those that weren't. Folk that were in Ellen or Toward. They didn't experience the physicality of actually living.
Yes, it was literally in your face, and at night, as kids would go to bed, and we'd hear all this stuff going on until you went to sleep, because it was a 24-hour operation, so there was just a lot going on all the time. The noise of diesel engines with the little ferries they had going back and forward. All kinds of submarines coming in during the night, leaving during the night, loading operations, unloading operations. And shortly after the Proteus arrived, which was the original boat, which was an old World War II submarine depot ship that they lengthened by cutting it down the middle and putting 44 feet in to accommodate the Polaris missile storage unit. So that the ship was there first of all, and then at the same time, in the Loch next door, we saw these prefabricated sections for the floating dock appear one by one. And by the end of 1961, I think the thing was assembled and also moored in the Loch, and that was another huge structure in a small loch. So the Loch was sort of divided into two shores. With the American Navy's Connor Basin in the middle of it. Some years ago, when it would have been the late 80s, we were in Hawaii. I went to Pearl Harbor and to the museum there. there's a sort of modernistic shaped museum, which is out on the water over one of the hulks that's still there, has been left as a war grave, paid for by Elvis Presley, if I remember correctly. And in that museum, there was a big oil painting of missiles loading and unloading in a dark night with heavy rain, and this was the Holy Loch. And it was just so weird to see that depiction of what I looked at out my windows and for so many years, and there it was, in Hawaii.
Do you remember the first American that you met, or the first group of Americans from the ship that you met?
First Americans would be some kids at school, I guess, Rushfield School, primary school. There were a couple of kids. It was, I may have got this wrong, but as I remember, when the American kids arrived, their school system didn't have them at the same place as we were. So they were often a couple of years behind, or they were put back a little bit so that life was easier for them. Because I think the early years of their education system was more relaxed than the Scottish system was at that time. That's what I remember about the Americans. As for the men, my mother, she was widowed a couple of years after the boat arrived. And after she got through the mourning process, she had a wild old social life with her friends and the American officers, because the officers rented the big seaside villas around the shore of the Loch, and were forever entertaining the local society, in inverted commas, to cocktail parties and dinners, and yeah, my mother loved it. She enjoyed their company, and the American officers were certainly men with charming manners, and they knew how to talk to a lady. The ratings were a bit different. At secondary school, our gym teacher, Joe Dallas, introduced softball to school, which we thought was a bit pandering to the invaders a little bit, because it became quite a big part of the curriculum. But that was introduced especially for the Americans. We had no idea what it was, and it didn't seem like a very soft ball to us either. It's like a cricket ball. I mean, the guys in my class, or guys that I knew, they were all fine. They were good guys. The whole business of the Americans coming here, it was such a long saga. But we actually, Dunoon has had long associations with America, mainly from the Civil War, when captains and ship owners who were running from Bermuda to the south, blockade running, invested heavily in shipping, and then when they'd made their money, they came and retired in Dunoon and invested in property. So a lot of the Dunoon villas are paid for by ill-gotten gains through the blockade running. Subsequently, the business of the base coming here and the study for that, Roosevelt was determined that the base would be located somewhere where it was near to a big major city, where the sailors could enjoy R&R and have access to civilization. And girls, basically, that was the argument. So they weren't interested in going anywhere where there wasn't prospect of female company. The main sectors that benefited from the Americans being here, there was, well, I guess taxi drivers and the Glasgow hookers, because they spent a lot of their money in Glasgow. Although they bought things locally in the early years, it wasn't long before they built a commissary, and so everything they bought basically came from the States, and their impact on local business reduced. So a few pubs and taxi drivers and hookers, that was about the limit of the impact. So it's often vastly overstated, what the benefits the Americans brought. Living on the shore of the Holy Loch, on the North Shore, and just looking over it 24 hours a day, it's always been something that's been fascinating to us, everyone who lives there, because it's scenically it's superb. South facing, it's in a nice little microclimate, so it's warm, relatively speaking, fairly sheltered. And everything that goes on in the loch is a sort of little theatre. There's entertainment there. And when the Americans were there, there was 24-hour-a-day entertainment, because initially, at least, the seamanship wasn't tremendous. They screwed up a lot of things and got themselves into trouble frequently. And having this to watch was a great thing. You could just sit and look out of the window rather than watch television. Yeah, a lot of stuff went wrong. And of course, we also watched the yacht racing from when we were kids. There was a racing mark in front of the house, and the boats going around that would always be entertainment on a Wednesday night. Holy Loch was the site of the two biggest yacht yards on the Clyde, two of the biggest in the country, I would guess. They didn't necessarily build a huge number of boats, but they were the major storage and maintenance locations. And they were truly vast, great hangar-like buildings and hundreds of boats. Of course, it's all gone now, but it seemed so permanent when it was there. Compared to Fife's over at Fairley or McGruer's in the Gairloch, they were just sort of little operations, although both built a lot of boats. But the Holy Loch yards were an industrial scale, justly famous.
Were the yards still building when the Americans were here?
Yeah, the Sovereign and Kariwa, 63 and 64, I think. America's Cup boats were built when the Americans were already here. Scepter was 57, that was before the Americans arrived. But they were still building boats. Not a huge number of boats, but still building boats. Robertson's, like Morris and Lorimer's, both yards were killed when Dennis Healy raised VAT on boats. And they were precarious operations, and that just sort of put the last nail in the coffin. Well, it was revoked a short time later, but the damage was done. Investors had already made the decision to pull out. The Queen's Harbour regulations for the Loch contained a provision where boats of the Holy Loch Sailing Club and the Benmore Adventure Centre could sail on the Loch, as long as they didn't approach nearer than whatever it was, 200 feet to the boat. That was the prevailing legislation right through. So, of course, many of the boats in and out of the Loch and all the boats that were worked on at the yard, most of them were not owned by Holy Loch Sailing Club members or Benmore Adventure Centre, but that was sort of a loophole in the legislation that nobody seemed too bothered about. My elder brother, I think he was rescued by the Americans twice, which, as far as I know, was a record. I don't think anyone else has been rescued twice. Once was enough for most people. And he was invited on board. He and his crew, Ellis Patterson, was my primary school teacher's son. They were invited on board for coffee and donuts, and then taken back ashore afterwards. That was the early days when there was good hospitality, and when the feeling between the local community and the ship was, everyone was prepared to give it a go. We didn't want it to come in the first place, but they were here and they were mostly nice people, and everyone was prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt, and everyone got on pretty well. In subsequent years, it did change a bit, but what the Americans thought of the yachting or the relationship with it, it was incredible to us that they seemed to have so little interest, and there seemed to be so few sailors. The original crew which came in, that crew was okay, but subsequent rotations, the new recruits from Savannah had never been to sea. Now, there was a story that Bob Donaldson likes to tell, that Callum McLaughlin, then the Commodore, was invited onto Hanley, I think it was, for an overnight cruise down the Firth and back up again the next day. This sort of thing they did, the Hearts and Minds operation. And Callum was appalled at what he saw, basically. And the crowning glory was that the new recruits had red and green wristbands with port and starboard written on them, which is just wonderful. I don't know if anyone ever got a photograph of that. Presumably there's a big community of Americans who were here and who communicate online. It'd be nice to know if anyone's, got a picture of that. From, I think, the second year they were there, the Americans hosted what we call the Polaris Regatta. So they sponsored some trophies and food and a little bit of logistics. The trophies were fairly hideous, but what was interesting to most people, at least in the early days, until everyone had seen it all and done it all, was an invitation out to the ship. So after the racing on a Saturday, they would lay on boats and take you out, and they showed the competitors around the ship. And yeah, it was interesting. Certainly, it wasn't at all like the Royal Navy. There was no ship-shape Bristol fashion type of activity. The men were very slovenly, generally wearing dirty trews and untucked t-shirts and stuff like that. It was quite different, and a lot of particularly the older guys, were rather shocked by this lack of seagoing etiquette on the boat. But I mean, the Americans did things differently, and there you go.
Did any of them ever take part in the racing?
Oh yes, the Americans at about the time when they started, when they sponsored the Polaris Regatta, they bought 2 Enterprise dinghies, 13-foot small sailing dinghies, and these were kept at the club and used by the American sailors, and not so many of them were terribly interested, but the commander of the ship did make sure they were crewed for the regattas, but they were by no means expert sailors. Later on, they sold the Enterprises and they got a Loch Long and a Piper, both of them new boats built at Robertson's.
They were new boats.
They kept them for a while, but they found the Piper a little bit flighty for the level of skill they had, so they sold that and bought another Loch Long. Subsequently, they sold the 2 Loch Longs, and then a different recreation committee on a different boat. Because each time the boats rotated, you had different people, obviously, in charge of these things. Bought 3 second-hand Pipers and had them for a while. But as an institution, they didn't look after their boats, and so they were forever sinking at moorings or being washed up on the beach or whatever. They tried, but few people were terribly skilled. There was one trophy won by an American crew. This was one year they were racing the Loch Long, and they did reasonably well in the first race on the Saturday, and then the wind blew up, and on the way back to the mooring, the boats had been steadily filling with water, and there was a southern gentleman steering the boat, I think, and a Filipino crewing, and the boat just sort of gradually went under, and the icebox floated out of the cabin and sort of slowly went down. And of course, they were submariners, so they weren't faced by this. The Filipino chap, though, had more of a sense of self-preservation, and he climbed the mast as the boat was sinking. And Alec Waddle, the local boatman who did rescue boat duties, puttered along, and the Filipino stepped dry shod onto Alec's boat just as the top of the mast was disappearing. True story. But then the next day, of course, they had no boat to sail, and they were allowed to use their other boat, use the Piper, so they actually competed in 2 different classes. And somehow the committee, in the spirit of a special relationship, I suppose, arranged to give them a combined result that gave them a prize. So basically, the Loch Long won the prize posthumously. That's the only prize the Americans ever won at any of the organised races.
Did you ever kind of hang out with any of the Americans? And I'm distinctly getting the impression that they had to choose to come and sail. So, it wasn't kind of part of their prescribed R&R to actually learn how to handle these small boats. No,
unlike the British Navy, which I think even now tries to get the guys into a whaleboat and teach them a little bit about sailing. The Americans didn't do that. The only decent sailor that I can remember was Tom McCrory. He worked for Rockwell Engineering as a contractor. So there were a number of people on the boat like him who were not actually, naval personnel, but they were attached to the Navy. And that's where most of the decent sailors came from. Tom was impressed by the Piper, the Robertson's-built boat. When he went back to the States, he became an importer of the boats. And so there's a handful of Pipers, I think half a dozen in the States, through Tom. It's part of our culture, but it's an industry that's almost completely disappeared. I did a survey of it for the book and found that there were people who wanted to build you a boat, and there were marinas where you could buy a boat built in Poland or something. But in terms of building boats, I think the biggest operation was Storm Katznile building speedboats.
Am I misremembering a story that someone's mast broke sailing underneath the anchor chain of the American ship?
Oh, right. Well, your Uncle Norman got stuck under the anchor chain.
Right. That's.
So that would be one of the two occasions. Yeah, his rudder blade fell off, I believe. That was what he told me, anyway. Interacting with the ship, there was an incident in the early days, again, just after the floating dock had arrived, and when the Americans had the Enterprise dinghies. One of the officers' wives and her friend took the Enterprise out, and when the floating dock was submerged, they sailed into it and tootled around. And everyone was just very relieved it was the wife of an American officer, because, but of course it's something everyone had wanted to do, but she was the only one who had the courage to do it.
You have been listening to the American Years Revisited podcast. Huge thanks to Euan Ross for taking the time to share his experiences with us. Euan's book, Highland Cows, on the history of Scottish sailing, can be bought in Book Point in Dunoon and is available online. Thank you for listening. See you next time.